Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing a San Jose Sharks prospect update. I haven't done one of these in the last few months, and so with it being near the end of April and most of the seasons worldwide having pretty much concluded, I thought why not take a look at how some of the Sharks' top prospects have been doing over their 23-24 season. Now, it should be noted that this is not an exhaustive list of every single San Jose Sharks prospect that they have. It turns out when you've been bad for multiple years, like San Jose has been, you end up accumulating a lot of at least pretty good prospects. But instead, I've decided to take a closer look at really the top prospects that the Sharks do have, which is why you'll notice the notable absences of players like Jake Furlong or Matthias Havlid. Instead of like in my previous video where I had like a dozen players to mention, I'll focus just specifically on these 8 guys. You shall also notice that I am not including any player who has played even a single game in the NHL, which is why there is no Shakir Mukhamadullin, Danil Gushin, or Jack Thompson on this list. I will talk about those players a bit more in a later video, but for now I'm specifically mentioning players who have yet to step foot in the NHL, and that starts off with the Sharks' top prospect, Will Smith, playing in the NCAA this season. When we last checked in on him, he was having an okay start to the season, over a point per game, but in terms of marks in the NCAA, he was 10th in points, 6th amongst freshmen, which in out of context is quite good, but in context, considering Will Smith was a 4th overall pick at that year's draft, it was expected that he would do a bit better than that. Well, that's exactly what we ended up getting. The second half of the season for Will Smith was absolutely outstanding, and he would end up with 41 games played, 25 goals, 46 assists for 71 points. The first player in the NCAA to reach 70 points since Kyle Connor did it about 10 years ago, and that's pretty good company to actually be with, as we know Kyle Connor is a very successful player in the NHL these days with the Winnipeg Jets. Will Smith would end up leading all freshmen in terms of points this past season. In fact, he would actually lead all players in terms of points with this output, and he was just really carrying Boston College, a very stacked Boston College, in a lot of the games that they did play. We saw Will Smith throughout this season, especially when he was in the World Juniors, be able to show up in a lot of the really big games. At that time, was with the United States, and when it came to Boston College and a lot of their championship or really type close games, he was being able to put up those points. There was one notable one, I believe it was against Boston University, home of hopefully future Shark Macklin Celebrini, where Will Smith had a 4-goal night to help Boston College secure the first seed in their particular division. Now, while the Boston College would end up losing in the championship game to Denver, getting shut out 2-0, Will Smith would still end up having an incredible offensive output, and so now the question becomes whether or not he will make the transition to the NHL, and realistically, it likely comes down to what Will Smith wants to do himself. I cannot imagine that the San Jose Sharks will go to him and say, we want you to play another year in college. It seems as though with his offensive performance that he is certainly ready to make the jump at least to a more professional league, NHL/AHL, and he would likely get a pretty good look in the NHL to see if he actually belongs there. But the major obstacle standing in his way, in the Sharks' way of being able to bring him over to the NHL, is whether or not he actually wants to do so. The wrinkle there is that he has played the last couple of years with his line mates Ryan Leonard and Gabe Perreault, first with the U.S. National Development Team, and this year with Boston College, they made up the freshman line for that group. And it has notably been announced over the last couple of weeks that Ryan Leonard will be returning to Boston College for his sophomore season. And I imagine there has been many conversations between these 3 players, considering how close they have been for the last couple of years. And so if Ryan Leonard is returning, there's a real distinct possibility that Will Smith may choose to go back as well for his sophomore season, perhaps viewing it as some sort of unfinished business with Boston College because they fell just short of that NCAA championship. Hopefully that is not the case. I'm sure me and many other Sharks fans would love to see Will Smith be able to make his NHL debut next season, but who knows at this point, really only he has to make that choice. Then we move on to Quentin Musty, who has had a very successful season in the OHL this year, putting up a ton of points. 108 points on the season, actually leads the OHL in terms of points per game by a pretty wide margin. That is almost 2 points per game from what he has played this season. So an incredible offensive output as well. And it should be noted that he was drafted in the same year as Will Smith, still in the first round with the New Jersey Devils draft selection acquired in the Timo Meier trade, which means this is still his draft plus 1 year. Sometimes you will see these types of offensive outputs from players in their draft plus 2 year, in their overager year, which at that point you don't read too deeply into it. But Musty being able to do it in D plus 1 is a very incredible feat and impressive output for sure. And like with Will Smith, the question does become whether or not he is able to make the transition to the NHL next season. Now, it is a bit more precarious because as a CHL player, Musty has really only two options going into next year. Either he sticks around in the NHL or the San Jose Sharks send him back to juniors. You cannot go into the AHL at Quentin Musty's age. Now, I imagine that will allow San Jose to give him that classic 9-game look in the NHL to see if he really truly belongs. And that's likely what it's going to come down to. But it's definitely somewhat difficult to imagine him going back to the OHL just because he has already dominated that league so much. It's hard to see what type of progress he can make in his development if he ends up back in the OHL. He already led the league in terms of points per game. Is he just going to do that a second time in a row? That won't necessarily help all that much. You could talk about honing his game and really rounding into form, but that seems like it would be more so successfully done with the San Jose Sharks organization instead of back in the junior league. So it'll definitely be quite interesting to see what Mike Grier does. If Quentin Musty really just doesn't look all that good in the 9-game stint, the Sharks will obviously have their hand forced and send him back to the OHL. But if he ends up having even just like a pretty good performance, they might want to just keep him around for the sake of it. Moving on, we then have Philip Bystedt, who has had a very interesting roller coaster career ever since being drafted by the San Jose Sharks at 27th overall a couple years back. When he was originally taken, this was Mike Grier's first draft selection as new GM for the San Jose Sharks. And it was definitely a bit of an off-the-board choice. Not many people were expecting Bystedt to go in the first round, but he surprised a lot of people in that 22-23 season. Had a relatively okay output in the SHL as a really young player, so that's a professional league in Sweden, so it's definitely tough to put up a ton of points there. But really what was really impressive from him was his World Juniors performance that year as an 18-year-old coming in and being one of, if not Sweden's best player in that tournament, was quite good. And so coming into this 23-24 year, heading back to Sweden, people were expecting some sort of step forward from Philip Bystedt, but instead they got a lot of stagnant play from him. His SHL output actually did not improve at all here this season, and when he went back to the World Juniors as a 19-year-old, expected to be a big leader on that Sweden squad, outside of the first game where he looked quite good, he was mostly invisible for the rest of that tournament, and so hopes for him continued to drop back to where they were pre-draft level. The good news for Bystedt is that he did manage to turn it around right near the end of the season once the Sharks decided to bring him over to the AHL. He played about 8 games with the Barracuda, which is admittedly a pretty small sample size, but he had 7 points over that 8-game span, which is a really solid amount of points over that time. And so it definitely is going to be the case for Philip Bystedt that he'll likely be starting the year next season in the AHL, and we shall see if he manages to maintain that type of offensive production next year, because you do not want to see him regress for like a second straight year. That's not very good for a player at his age. So we'll see what he manages to do at the North American level. I don't think he'll be much of a factor for the San Jose Sharks themselves next year, unless he has an absolutely outstanding training camp. But in a couple of years' time, maybe that could be more so his target. Then we have Ethan Cardwell, actually the oldest player on the board and the only player here who has played the entirety of this past season with the San Jose Barracuda. And I didn't actually think I'd be discussing him in a prospect update video, mostly because I felt as though he'd get at least one game in the NHL just based on how he had done with the Barracuda, but that did not end up happening. 71 games played, 23 goals, 20 assists for 43 points. It should be noted that Cardwell is a rookie in the AHL, so while this point total might not seem might not seem incredibly impressive in the AHL grand scheme of things. It's not as though he's like top 5 or top 10 or anything. If you take a look at just AHL rookies, he's actually the 4th leading goal scorer amongst that group of players, which is really good for a player who didn't necessarily have such high expectations. I mentioned how he is the oldest player on this board. He is also the only player here or the only forward here, I should say, who was not drafted within the first 50 selections of their respective draft. Cardwell was a 4th round pick from a couple of years ago. And so the expectations weren't exceptionally high, but he has worked very, very hard to get to this point, which is why I was very surprised to not see him get an NHL game this year. But I imagine if this type of level of production does continue, he should get at least a couple of looks next season. Whether or not he become a consistent player for the San Jose Sharks is pretty much just up to the type of performance he's able to give in those short looks. But with the San Jose Sharks likely looking to get a bit younger next season with more raw talent, I guess you could say, Cardwell could definitely be a very interesting option for the Sharks' bottom 6. Then we get to Casper Hunin, also a player who is a bit one-dimensional, I would say, as a guy playing in the OHL this season. In fact, his season actually continues to go on with the London Knights. They are in the Final Four in the OHL playoffs. He has been one of the best players for the London Knights during their postseason run, so that has been quite nice to see. But like I said, a goal scorer through and through, which is fine. There are many players in the NHL who pretty much are strictly goal scorers and don't necessarily bring a ton else to the table. Alex Ovechkin is probably the most notable of those players, being one of the best, if not the best goal scorer of all time. Hunin was sent back here to the OHL to try and round out the last bit of his game, to try and make him at least a bit more defensively responsible and just generally improving in other areas. I'd say he did a pretty decent job at that. 32 goals, 29 assists for 61 points in 57 games. That is over a point per game pace. Also had a pretty successful World Juniors, I would say, with Finland as an 18-year-old, not necessarily given the time of day usually in that tournament, and yet still managed to put up a few points. We'll see how he manages to do next year, where I imagine he will make his return to Finland for that World Juniors 2024. When it comes to NHL aspirations next season, very, very doubtful that actually ends up happening. Hunin will likely be sent back for his draft plus 2 year to the OHL to see what he can do once again, but could be a very interesting player within the next 2 or 3 years. Next, we have Cam Lund, another player like with Will Smith playing in the NCAA, but unlike Will Smith, who was on an extremely stacked Boston College team featuring multiple first-round selections in the NHL, Cam Lund was on a bit of a weaker group with Northeastern. He himself had a pretty good season here in his sophomore year, 11 goals, 19 assists for 30 points. Not quite a point per game, but relatively close. Unlike Will Smith, who I think it is completely up to him whether or not he will make that transition to the NHL. For Cam Lund, it is likely that the San Jose Sharks will tell him to head back to college for yet another year to play his junior season, and then they'll come to the negotiation table to see if whether or not he'll sign an entry-level deal at that point. As we've seen with Colin Graff, even with strong numbers in college, it is an incredibly difficult transition from the NCAA to the NHL, and so Cam Lund probably isn't going to be able to make that jump just yet, so why not keep him there for yet another year? Then we get to David Edstrom, the only player on this list who I didn't mention in my last prospect video. This is because he was only recently acquired by the San Jose Sharks from the Vegas Golden Knights in the Tomas Hertl trade. Was drafted in the same year as Philip Bystedt, just a few spots after him in 30s. Oh no, he was actually drafted just this past season. My mistake, 2023. Since the Vegas Golden Knights did win the Stanley Cup, he was the 32nd overall pick in that particular draft, so very much a borderline first-round draft pick, but he had a relatively decent season in the SHL this year, came into the World Juniors as an 18-year-old, so not like I mentioned with Hunin, given the time of day by the coaches at that point, put up 3 assists in 7 games, not a terrible offensive output, so definitely the type of player who will almost certainly return to the SHL next year, I would imagine, to see if, unlike Bystedt, he can actually manage to take a couple of steps forward instead of stagnating there. And then finally, we get to the only defenseman on the board here today, which is Luca Kagnino, playing in the WHL this past season with the Portland Winterhawks, and it was an incredibly successful season for Kagnino, at least when it comes to his offensive production. 18 goals, 72 assists for 90 points in the 65 games that he played. Remember, this is as a defenseman in the WHL, and the WHL is actually not known to be the highest scoring junior leagues in the CHL. So much so, and this mark was so impressive, that he is actually the first defenseman to put up 90 points in about 30 years in the WHL, which is just an incredible record for Kagnino. And like I mentioned with Quinton Musty, it should be noted that Kagnino was drafted this past season, which means this isn't some overager year where you're expected a bit of an inflated point total. This is draft +1 as well. So it is an incredible achievement that he had managed to put up this many points as an offensive defenseman in that particular league. Now, it should be noted, of course, the reason why Kagnino was originally drafted in the 4th round this past season is his size as a defenseman, standing at just 5'9". This is the type of obstacle that isn't all that detrimental to a player when they're playing in the junior league, because most of the other players that you will be against will also be of similar size, I would say, since you're against 17, 18, 19-year-old types of guys, many players who haven't really grown fully into their own bodies, into their own frames, and so there's a lot more space to make things work as a smaller player. This is the type of advantage that does not exist in the NHL, where you're against like 30-year-old 6'5" type of players who will just absolutely punish you if you come relatively close to them, which is why a lot of the smaller players have to develop specific instincts in the NHL if they want to find success, but that doesn't mean that players of that size have not found success in the NHL. Look at Braden Point with the Tampa Bay Lightning, who is one of the best centermen in the NHL, putting up tons and tons of goals, tons and tons of points, winning multiple Stanley Cups with the Tampa Bay Lightning, and he's, I believe, even shorter than Luca Kagnino, though of course he's not a defenseman, so that is slightly different. But the fact of the matter is that there is the potential to be able to find that success, but it should be noted that it's going to be slightly difficult path for him. I imagine when it comes to actually making the jump to the NHL next season that it does not actually end up happening. He will likely return to the WHL for his his overage season, unless he is just absolutely outstanding through training camp, and will maybe be able to see his jump to the AHL in a couple of years, and perhaps in the NHL a year after that. But he seems to be one of the highest potential defensemen that the San Jose Sharks have as a prospect. When it comes to a couple of their other ones like Thrun and Mukamadulin, these guys have decent potential to be like top 4 defensemen, but Kagnino, perhaps because he's a lot more raw, he does seem to have that ability to raise the offense to the next level, and if he can find a way to make that size work at the NHL level, perhaps he could really become a great player for the San Jose Sharks within a few years from now. But that will do it for this prospect update. It is quite clear that compared to just 5 years ago, the San Jose Sharks prospect pool is significantly better. I believe The Athletic marked them as the 4th best prospect pool currently in the NHL, and that was before the trade of Anthony Duclair to pick up Jack Thompson and before the trade of Tomas Hertl to pick up David Enstrom. So realistically, it has only gotten better from there, and with another top draft pick that the Sharks will have this season, even if it is not first overall, it'll be top 3. The Sharks prospect pool may end up being one of, if not the best, in a year's time. Class dismissed.